good slide.
Hello again. I know we're not supposed to have favorites, but this panel is my favorite just because it's forward-looking. I think as some of the other panelists have said, our objective collectively is not just to preserve democracy, but really to go beyond, to rebuild, Flavia said, vitalize a democracy that works for all of us. And so this panel is focused on building inclusive democracy. And it's asking a really critical question at a moment in which we're seeing a global backlash against inclusion in many parts of the world. And so the question is, what does it mean to build a democracy that doesn't just tolerate difference, but embraces it? So I am delighted to be in the company of these brilliant panelists. You already met Chris for a moment, but Chris Muriithi is one of our global fellows, Kenyan activist for LGBTQ+ rights, and the founder of Bold Network Africa. María Teresa Kumar, one of our senior fellows, president of Voto Latino and the Voto Latino Foundation, and Koketso Moeti, another of our global fellows, a South African activist and the founder of Amandla.Mobi. And it is just, I am such a fan of the three of you, so it's a pleasure to be here. So I wanted to start with you, Chris. In your work with Bold Network Africa, what role do you see narratives playing in supporting inclusive democracy, and why is this so urgent right now?
Yeah, I mean, as an African, the first thing that I always lean into is that storytelling existed for so many years. Our forefathers, our communities, that is how we learned, and that's how we, came together to be able to imagine the future, to solve issues that we have, and to make sure that everybody is included in one way or another. So what Bold Network Africa is doing is really just going back to our original roots, to remind people that narratives are the architecture of culture. And once you're able to share these stories to people, to different communities, for example, in Kenya, where there is this thing that politicians and leaders constantly throw, to society, where they say, being queer is an African. The only way to challenge that is to use narratives, to go back into history and to say, even before colonization happened, African queer people existed. And these were even the names that they used, going back into the culture. And then also now coming to the now, where we're able to showcase, individuals like this who are part of a network that is 10,000 people strong across Kenya, queer people and allies, to be able to say, let's use our voices, let's tell our stories, let's push back on these harmful narratives that queer is an African and it's a Western agenda. It is not. We exist, this is my story, and I am here to stay. So, when I think about that, it's one way to push back, on these harmful narratives that come from authoritarian rule. Yeah.
I love that. Maria Teresa, I want to sort of bring you in. Thinking about right now, what do you see as the greatest threat in this country to inclusive democracy, and how different, or is it different from the past? Is this moment different, I guess, is the question I want to ask.
First of all, I want to thank the Kettering Foundation for having these conversations, because in a time where people are trying to shut down dialogue and thought, both here and internationally, it does come to prove when you have rooms like this that not only is it important to have outward dialogue, but to find solutions. And I think that more than ever right now, if you were to ask me how we got to this moment, was the lack of narratives, the lack of dialogue. And that falls strictly into where we are as a multicultural America. So in the last 2 decades, the fastest growing group of Americans have been not only of Hispanic descent, but they've been American, meaning that they were born here. They're also the reason why the United States is one of the few countries where we still see a population growth, because of the children of immigrants. And so someone earlier was asking, well, why are we here? Well, because for the last 25 years, there has not been a leader to explain the multicultural America that our teachers, that our doctors, that our firefighters, that the folks that work in the field have witnessed every single day. And so if you don't have anyone narrating what America actually looks like, and at the same time experience massive inequality that we have experienced for the first time in, I would say, 100 years, it is easy for a demagogue to come in and to lay that blame on the feet of the most recently arrived. And I have to share with you, as we each tell our story, I encourage you all to make sure that you are checking in with those marginalized communities, that you are checking in with your coworkers who happen to have immigrant roots. Because there is not a place where I don't go and a Latino professional or a Latino taxi driver or a Latino asks me, how are you doing? And then leans in and says, no, how are you really doing? Because there's not one of us who does not know a loved one impacted. There's not one of us who does not know someone that has to decide how to take care of their child in the event that they don't go home. And so how we got here was a lack of courage, a lack of curiosity, of a demographic of Americans that is quickly going to be the economic engine of this country if we allow us to thrive equally. If I were to have a plot graph here of the majority of white Americans in this country, the most common age, it's 58 years old. For the African American community, it's roughly 32, 33 years old. For the Latino community, it's 15. So we're talking about a generation and a half at best that is just coming into the American experience, who proudly loves their family, proudly loves being American. But the moment they step out that door, they're immediately othered. And I don't have to share with you like the virtues of a multicultural America, because when we came together in 2018, it was the first time that a vast majority of Americans voted during a midterm. And we voted in the most diverse Congress that we had ever seen in our country. And when people ask me, why does diversity matter? That body, for the very first time, looked closer to America. We had the most women, the most indigenous, the most LGBTQ, the youngest, the most veterans, you name it. And together, comprehensively, we did what this room tries to do every day: be a battle of ideas to determine the best possible outcomes for our constituency. And that body produced 400 pieces of legislation that spoke to our values. You name it, they did it. Whether we're talking about immigration policy, whether we're talking about LGBTQ issues, whether we're talking about fair wages, whether we're talking about whether or not a woman should have access to her agency. And then we did it again. And then we got tired because voting was too hard. Because somehow the guys that are actually a minority of us got into our head. And so if you were to ask me like what I think is our possibility, it's very much is that there is a majority of Americans that do not sleep well at night seeing what is happening to their neighbors. And we have to determine what is the next iteration of a multicultural democracy. Because the reason that there are nefarious actors trying to divide us through Russian interference, disinformation, is because they recognize that the next century, the one that we're living in, the strength of that economy, of that leadership, of that possibility, is human capital with the brightest ideas. And so they try to divide us along our historical Achilles heel, which is race. But if you were to talk to my daughter, who is an alpha generation, she technically represents the largest demographic of American children. And no, it's not Latino. It's a bicultural American. And you can imagine how confused they must be when they see the adults in the room trying to other what she embodies. And we can debate about whether DEI is appropriate for this moment or not. And I'm the first to tell you that's a blunt instrument, but it is a tool to prepare our institutions for the children already born. My daughter is 13 years old, and she represents the alpha generation, a majority minority group of Americans who absolutely does not represent our boardrooms or our halls of Congress. But if we take away those instruments to prepare our country, then we're weaker for it. But if we embrace our superpower of what is multiculturalism and what it means to have standards and what it means to make demands on an inclusive society, what we've been able to demonstrate as Americans is that when we do good policy, and even when we do bad, it does have a spillover effect in the rest of the world. And I cannot imagine how other minority groups around the globe feel right now as we are dismantling our superpower that held to account those leaders that were trying to do harm.
Thank you. As the mom of a Gen Zer, who is also part of that bicultural generation, I really appreciate your remarks, and it gives me hope. And I struggle to give her that hope, so thank you. Koketso. Thinking about Maria Teresa's comments about that spillover effect, talk to us about South Africa. What do you see right now as the greatest threat to inclusion, and how is that different from South Africa's past?
Inequality, without a doubt. The week before I came here, on Monday, my colleague had been quite sick. She went to the local clinic and she was removed. She was removed because a vigilante, a xenophobic vigilante group, has been going around to our health facilities, our public health facilities, targeting migrants and forcefully removing them from hospitals to clinics. It was such a symbol of how much, when you try to sift out some people from certain services, it impacts us all. The Thursday before I came here, Thursday the 17th, Operation Dudula, this vigilante group, had decided that it was going to march to our Human Rights Commission, the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, and a couple of other institutions. What they were going to do is fight against those who are supporting those who are stealing our resources. When inequality is so pervasive, instead of demanding better from those who have the power to do so, public spending, quality universal health services, the powerful rather incentivize us to fight each other. And that is how it manifests. People are being deprived of what are very, very basic services, and services that should be serving us all. On the day when they were protesting, we went to the office of the Socioeconomic Rights Institute. I come from a community that was a former client of theirs. They are a partner organization. They have represented movements. We went there, Abahlali Basemjondolo, the African Reclaimers Organization, the Street Traders Organizations, and other values-aligned progressive institutions. And we went to send a message. We will not be intimidated by hate, because the anger is very real. The services are collapsing, but it is not each other we should be fighting. And it was such a beautiful moment of solidarity, a coming together of unlikely suspects, movements, organizations, people who are just interested in what the future could be. We came together across racial lines. We came together across class lines. And when Operation Dudula arrived at that office, They attempted to provoke. They attempted to bat for violence, but we held the line. We are not here to fight you. The services are bad, but you are targeting the wrong people. And by doing so, they were so deflated that the politics of hate and fear did not work and would not move us. It completely disorientated them. It angered them even more. But it deflated what they thought was their power so much that after leaving there, they did not go to the next institutions they had wanted to protest to. And that is the power of what is possible when we come together in this way.
I love that. I want to sort of poke you a little bit more on that, because I love that you're talking about one of the tactics for countering this othering, the forced division. What institutions, I mean, you spoke about this a little bit, but what movements, what institutions, where are you seeing this potential? Where is it growing?
So I come from South Africa. Mm-hmm. And so right now, like many times in the world before, we know that there are elite, powerful corporations and hate-fueled provocateurs that want us to despair, that want us to look at the world and say, it is so ugly and awful, our only option is to despair and say that there is no hope. But we are very powerful, and I should know this. As a child in 1994, I watched the birth of democracy in South Africa. This happened despite the escalating violence of the preceding years. The political violence of the negotiations and the transitions was huge. I come from a repressive homeland. So homelands were territories, ethnically based territories that Black people were sent to. The apartheid state wanted to formalize the idea that we can be apart but equal, separate but equal. Just before, in the lead up to the 1993 election, and basically Black people were stripped of their citizenship. In the lead up to the 1994 election, in the homeland I am from, there was an attempt to prevent people from voting in the first democratic election. There was an attempted coup. A right-wing paramilitary forces came and took the side of the then leader, and people took to the streets. It would famously be known as the Bophuthatswana uprising. From the teachers to the street traders, every single person refused to cooperate and said, you will not deny us this democratic vote, despite the violence that was unleashed on everybody. The systems of non-cooperation and the way courage was incentivized in that moment, even the army of the government that was trying to keep us from voting turned against the president of the homeland at the time and joined forces. People crossed over the line. Now, this was happening in a context of various forms of resistance in the country that were going on. And again, there was internal resistance to apartheid, but it was supported by mounting international pressure. We're talking about internationalists who secretly worked for the ANC's armed resistance, Umkhonto we Sizwe. We're talking about the international anti-apartheid movement, which led campaigns like the 35-year boycott campaign, boycotting South African goods. This is not unique to South Africa. The world is full, so full of examples of transformative change that were forced because the masses came together, whether at a domestic level or, like in the case of South Africa, at an international levels. And so these struggles should serve as reminders that a different world is possible and that together we can imagine and build it. For people like us who were born into apartheid, It should have been unimaginable that anything else was possible. For people who were born into these systems, it should have been, but it wasn't, because the impulse of freedom lived in us because of our forefathers, because of what we were seeing all across, all around us, whether in South Africa or outside. There are many recent examples I can give you, from Guatemala to South Korea to Kenya, events that were triggered by single events, single major events. But the fights and the reasons why people took to the streets and came together in the way they did was about more than what had triggered that event.
I want to bring in Chris here. Wow. You know, you talked about using history in terms of narratives and to counter the sort of foreign influence rhetoric. I wonder, how do you think about using history to reimagine the future, as Koketso was talking about, to sort of impulse this inclusive future in which our inclusion is seen as a democratic strength?
I mean, in the morning I was thinking about this and I was like, what a time to be Kenyan. You know, as Kenyans, what has been happening in our country for the last 2 years has really, originally it broke our spirits, but all of a sudden, you know, it united us. I was looking at the list of the people who are in the room, and I noticed that there's a Kenyan in the room. And I was like, I cannot wait to say hi to you, because what a time to be Kenyan. You know, last year in 2024, on the 25th of June, the current government that, again, lied to people, you know, through this the playbook that all authoritarians, you know, follow. And Kenyans had gotten to the place where we were comfortable, and people were like, oh, I don't need to vote. You know, like, talking politics was not cool anymore. And people got comfortable, and this guy got into power. And on the 25th of June last year, that's when something happened in our country, and we have never gone back. He wanted to introduce a finance bill that was going to overtax people, that was going to push back on like so many amazing policies that had existed. And young Kenyans, you know, even the movement is called the Gen Z movement. Young Kenyans said, we will march until we enter parliament to make sure that that bill is not passed. And the politicians looked at us and thought, I mean, you know, Kenyans always talk a big game, but nothing is going to happen. But it did. The young generation said, we have nothing to lose. For the first time in my life, I watched TikToks of young people recording themselves and saying, I might not come back home. I might die. But it is okay that I will die to fight for my country, because our forefathers, the Mau Mau, the veterans who fought against colonialism, did it. And this is why we've been enjoying these freedoms. So who am I to sit comfortable and not take that baton that has been passed on to me to be able to fight for this country? And when I think about that, and when I sat in that moment, you know, watching all that happen, I went to the streets. I had to be in the streets to also push back and make sure that my voice, you know, was heard. But I came back home as a queer person, and I was overjoyed as a queer Kenyan, because for the first time in my life, queer people marched side by side with other people, and there was no othering. All of us spoke one language, which was, we the people are fighting against one person who is trying to push back on us. So we do not look at each other here as this is a fight for women, this is a fight for queer people. We the people march together with all our flags, Kenyan flags, pride flags, towards, you know, parliament, and we were successful. People were able to enter. Unfortunately, we lost lives. But that again started something else. People said, we will go back to the streets in 1 week to celebrate and honor the young people who were killed. And that has never stopped. It's been 2 years. This year again, on the 25th of June, we were on the streets. Unfortunately, I wasn't home, and I felt so bad that I wasn't there, because what a time to be Kenyan. You know, all our voices matter. And I think when I think about, you know, like going back into history, it's leaning onto that community and knowing that we only have ourselves to fight for our country. And when we only have ourselves, then we cannot afford to be divided as the people, because that's what they enjoy. They enjoy, you know, pushing these narratives of Like I said, being queer is not African. So all of a sudden, people are feeling some type of way about queer Africans. They enjoy pushing back, on women's rights. So all of a sudden, men feel like this is not our issue and maybe we should not push back. But, just leaning onto that, we all have each other. And, I look at what is happening in America and I'm like, oh, wow. I hope for the day that people will move beyond individualism as a country, and all of you will say, this is our problem and all of us need to solve it, and not letting one group be the one to always stand in front, of this government that is constantly pushing back on people. So that's how I would answer it. It brought us together and we forgot about othering, each other, and we marched towards the future that will be Kenyan, which will be us removing that president who is currently pushing back on us, and us imagining a better future where we will never forget where we came from.
So I think that was a perfect segue. María Teresa, I was going to ask you, what do you see as unexpected alliances or potential in this moment in the U.S., especially at a time when Latinos are being targeted for this othering?
So, I think it's a complicated answer to a complicated moment to a complicated reaction. And I say this because oftentimes people say, well, young people, we want them to march in the streets. And we don't realize that this generation of young people, that's all they've been doing. Right? It started with marching against war, against the environment, for the environment, Occupy Wall Street, immigration, down the list. And for the last good 20 years, what we talk to them about is mythology. Because they have always been, their whole life has lived through instability, insecurity, stock markets, loss of hope. I can go through all of it. And increasing inequality. And so our challenge is to speak to young people, to give them the agency of what happens when they do get involved. Because I take exception when someone says, well, young people are apathetic. They have some of the highest volunteerism than any generation. They're incredibly community-based, incredibly generous with each other, and do try to fix things. But government has not responded fast enough to their challenges and to their needs. And so when you start looking at unlikely allies, in this moment, one of the things I think we need to do is, and this is going to sound a little, naive, but we need to have more cross-generational dialogue of what it means to be an ally. I can tell you that during the pandemic, we had so many older white Americans calling Voto Latinos, like, what can we do? And we said, will you join Zoom calls and do text banking and phone calls to talk about the importance of voting? And we would have 2,000, 3,000 folks on these Zoom calls. Half of them were 17, 18, 21-year-olds, all Latino, and the rest were elderly white people. And what was really powerful about those moments and those convenings were so many of the young Latinos were saying, I didn't realize that Americans would care. Granted, they were American. But it was a moment of joining and conjoining and understanding commonalities. And I think that one of the challenges when I say that this is a complex issue, that the moment the Muslim ban came into effect the last time around, everybody rushed out of their homes to a local airport and said, not on our watch. There are 65 million Latinos in this country, 17 million of them who live in mixed status families. When we see videos of ICE running down the fields of a migrant worker who's picking our food, when we see videos of parents crying as a child is being taken away from them, when we see videos of foster parents getting ripped apart aside from a 5-year-old child that is now in a detention facility, my fellow Americans are not rushing the streets. I love this country to the bone because I've been fortunate enough to come from a country where being outspoken, we're being creative, we're being a dreamer, is ostracized and can get you killed. So I understand what a beautiful gift it is to be American. But I can also tell you, as a Latino American, it hasn't been more lonely. Because what folks don't understand is that when they go after ICE and they militarize our inner cities and our rural communities, it is the canary in the coal mine for what they intend to do to the rest of the country. When the headline says that the Supreme Court has allowed to consider taking away birthright citizenship, it's not about birthright citizenship. It's the abdication of judicial review. Because what it has in the back of that citizenship executive order are the 300 that he's already signed that guts our elections, that guts our agencies. And so what this administration has cleverly figured out is that because we do not have narratives, because people, when they see someone suffering in the Latino community, almost as voyeurism, because we actually don't know each other, they have taken our own bias that we may have against our fellow neighbors and loved ones to use it as a backdoor to strip our fundamental democratic norms. And I speak candidly because I think that we are in an opportunity where I am seeing local communities rise up and defend the rights of their neighbors. There was, about 3 months ago, there was a mother in upstate New York with 3 children. ICE came and took her. Turned out she was the wrong person, but she was undocumented. And they sent her to a facility and her children to a place in Texas. And that one of them, the youngest one, was a 3rd grader. And that elementary school principal signed a petition, mobilized his community, and said, "Not on my watch." And that family was returned. Because what we don't understand is that when we make noise, when we demonstrate our humanity and our dignity and that we care, that is our collective American value. Because we can oftentimes debate about history and what we haven't done. But what I've been fortunate enough to witness as I travel around the country is that there's not one person that doesn't ask me, what can I do right now? And at minimum, it's courage. At minimum, it's checking in on your neighbor. But at maximum, is exercising our democratic norms of holding the people who are abdicating their responsibility to do their job. We may have a difficult time with the administration, but you have 400 plus members of Congress and Senate that need to do their job. This idea that a sitting US senator was put to his knees and handcuffed without outrage, his degrees did not matter, his title did not matter. That moment with Senator Padilla was what every single Latino in this country felt viscerally. Because just like our African American community, brothers and sisters, we understand what it means to be racially profiled and to live in fear when a cop has all the power. And all I can think of was, thank goodness the cameras were rolling. And my God, he had to go talk to his 9-year-old son to explain to him what happened.
Thank you. So I want to, if anyone has any questions, we do have the 2 mics. I did want to get a few questions from those of you out here. Awesome.
First, thank all 3 of you. Maria, Teresa, it's good to see you, as always. So much I want to ask, but I want to ask a question that brings in a dimension that we haven't yet talked about. And it strikes me in all 3 of the contexts, faith plays a pretty significant role, and it has been a major part of the freedom struggles in all 3 contexts in different ways, but it's also been weaponized and misused to be one of the strongest forces driving exclusion and now authoritarianism. And so I would just be curious to have you reflect on that a little bit, and I certainly know the US context the best, it's my own, deeply resonate with the vision you cast. And yet we also know that there are many white Christians in particular that have kind of been seized this narrative of victimization and of grievance, and of what many of us refer to as white Christian nationalism, that it has been a major driving force for the MAGA movement. And some of that has started to infiltrate many different communities, including many Latino communities. And on the flip side, there has been a lot of reticence and sometimes even hostility from the progressive movement and from Democrats toward people of faith. And I think that is at least one of the challenges that we are facing. So, I really want to hear from all 3 of you, but I just wanted to kind of name a particular challenge and problem that I see in the US context.
Thank you. Does anyone?
I'm happy to start it. First Lorelei and now Adam, I feel like you brought my whole classmates back from the Kennedy School. Adam, I think one of the things that among the progressive movement, what has been missed is the cornerstone of faith. And I think that one thing that folks actually don't realize is that the largest group of Americans who sponsor refugees and asylum seekers are white Christians, more so than any other community. And so the more that we can actually start bridging this idea of what faith really means, and that is being respectful and accepting and pushing our boundaries sometimes when things are a little uncomfortable, that will bring, personally I think, that will bring, one, healing, necessary dialogue, but also it helps create a path forward. If you were to ask me in these coalitions what is missing, I would say faith is one and business leaders are another. And there is not a democracy that thrives and sees a second day unless there is stability in the streets. And that is through spiritual guidance, and that is through capitalist democracy. That is through stable markets. And so I do believe that the more that we can have a conversation around values and what it really means, because I do think that on the far right evangelicals, they've hijacked Christianity to what's the fanciest car you drive versus being thoughtful and caring and loving. And I'm grateful for the work that you've been doing and constantly making sure that they're members of Congress listening to the importance of laying that foundation. I do think that the country right now needs a movement of healing, not just for what's happening today, but really we never healed from the pandemic and the tragedy and the loss. And we kind of went on our way. And I think that the more we can talk about pain and using that for hope and healing and moving forward as a country. You asked earlier, what the challenge is. I think somehow we allowed patriotism to be sent to the other side as if it was a dirty word, and it's actually patriotism and faith and heal and love and unification as Americans that gets us out of bed and makes us believe together. So.
You want to jump in? Yeah.
I just want to quickly jump in, and I'm not answering your question, actually. I'm responding to something you said, just about the stable markets. I don't believe that, right? The neoliberal logic is precisely why we find ourselves here, right? Inequality that some people accumulate at the levels that they do is precisely why we find ourselves in this moment. And some of the examples from Guatemala to Kenya and everywhere else where I am finding hope right now, I think one of the things is that what people are calling for is futures in which people, ourselves as individuals, our families and our communities can thrive. Humanity can thrive collectively, rather than mass accumulation for the few at our collective expense, you know? And I think that is part of why we find ourselves right here and why we need to see why this moment, the environmental devastation that we are seeing now, is precisely a direct result of that massive accumulation, you know? Right now, a genocide is unfolding. There is an entire economy that has been built around that genocide, you know? And so the markets, as they have existed, are part and parcel of the problems, and stability and peace at the expense of justice will not be a peace that can work for us and that will allow humanity to thrive.
I wanted to get in, Chris,
Yes.
did you have a...
So no, I mean, I think that if you looked at when the United States was through this moment, it was basically during the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, and there was not a redistribution. And that is there was a common understanding that in order for us to thrive as a country, that we needed to have a thriving middle class, and that was a choice. And then around the 70s and 80s, all of a sudden we decided that we weren't going to have that choice. And so I think that there has to, I mean, we could have a longer discussion. I'm not in disagreement with you. I don't think that unfettered markets is the answer, but it's an understanding of how do we bring in business who feels that they don't have a hand in any of this or a consequence into an equation where it is, to your point, everybody thriving.
And Chris, I'm wondering if you had a comment too to the question about faith.
I mean, from the African context, it's very, very different. Again, when we lean into history, Christianity and, faith came to really divide us, as a people, because we were spiritual, Africans who believed in certain ways of life. And then Christianity was introduced by colonial powers that came and said, this is wrong, you are wrong, you should not exist, and that. So it's been, it managed to colonize our parents for very many years. But right now we are seeing a very big difference, even with how young people interact with Christianity. And when I speak, from a queer community point of view, again, we are constantly, the anti-rights group in Africa, specifically East Africa, are hugely funded by white Christians. We see the people who come to Kenya to push this whole agenda of giving money to politicians to be able to go and push a bill through parliament, family laws, family protection laws. And for us, it completely rubs us off the wrong way. So there's a wave of people, going back to our African roots of spirituality and holding, Christian leaders accountable, even with, the latest protests that are not going to stop. We have a hashtag that we say, drain the swamp. And the swamp is everybody, including churches, who locked their doors when young people were being shot outside the churches. The older generation that said, this is not my struggle. The politicians who chose to look the other way when, all these evil things were happening. So for us, drain the swamp is everybody. And we have seen, Christian leaders starting to turn around and say, we are sorry. We did not listen. We can understand that this is not just a fight for the young people. We understand that this is also for us. So that's why I said my answer will really be layered, when it comes to that. Yeah,
I appreciate that. Brett, let me get you in.
Thanks. I think a really important discussion on faith. And I wanted to introduce another thing that I feel has been missing the whole day here, which is technology. Because what we are seeing here is not just autocratic government, it's autocratic government driven by technology in coalition with big business, the richest businesses we've ever seen in the history of the world, which enable frightening surveillance, but also algorithms that are dividing us, right? And I know that some of you are also using technology to mobilize people, so Koketso, and Chris, you also talked about Gen Z are using TikTok and so on. So can you talk about the role of technology in dividing, but also how you see that, how do we use technology and subvert it to create inclusion?
You want to jump? Yep.
Yeah, so across the world, I mean, the super rich and big corporations are using digital platforms to sway public opinion, right? To concede that this is the only way to go. Autocrats are the only way to go. The amounts of money, there's been a lot of scrutiny around the Musk and Trump relationship, but it is not unique. I'm thinking about Ambani and Andani in India, who have been longtime supporters of Prime Minister Modi, as an example, right? In South Africa, certain industries have such influence in our government and. The thing about technology, I think, is it's neither here nor there, right? Technology is a tool, and technology has always existed. The scale is very different at the moment. The amounts of money we're talking about is very, very different at the moment, and. But what is very fascinating, the digital sphere, like any other public sphere where we should not have existed, where we were previously not allowed to protest, we are seeing such massive examples of it being subverted to be used for those purposes, despite what some people want it to be used for, you know? And so there is a need to regulate and curtail the powers and protect the digital sphere, which has, in some respects, expanded civic space at a whole new realm, you know? And we should defend it as a public and think about what does it mean to build technological public infrastructure? What does it mean to regulate in ways that serve society and not the individuals who are profiteering off of this? And I think there's quite a few, and I'm happy to take this offline, there's quite a few examples of groups that are doing some fantastic experiments at the moment on this.
So can I just I'd like to bring in our last, I'm realizing we're at time, if I bring in the last question, and then you can sort of respond to both, if that works.
Maybe it's on. Can you hear me? There we go.
There.
Caleb Smith, I'm the Director of LGBT Policy at the Center for American Progress. Thank you so much for including this conversation in the discussion around democracy. As someone who is often in multi-issue spaces representing my community, sometimes the conversation really tends towards what can you compromise on? What rights can we wait on while we figure out this crisis? How can we compromise here on trans folks so that we can grow our tent on our side? And practically, I think we know that there is some level of harm reduction that we have to do and some level of compromise that has to occur. But how do we really navigate the harm reduction that's okay and the compromise that's okay while still holding on to, you know, the core of the rights that we absolutely need to protect no matter what? I'm just curious if y'all have thoughts. Thank you.
That's a great.
I'll start by answering, you know, the social media question. Again, in Kenya, both for the queer community and the young generation, we have been amazed, you know, with how social media, you know, helped fuel, you know, our need to be on the streets almost every other week. The coordination that happens on social media, the education that happens on this platform, and people, you know, like breaking down the Constitution. This is what this means, and this means that we have power to be able to do this. People organizing, you know, in different contexts and saying, on this day, the people of this specific region of the country are going to go and protest outside a members of parliament's house, and they will not stop until it is done. And it's all coordinated, and all of a sudden on a certain day, people are protesting in Mombasa, in Nairobi, in Kisumu, in Kakamega, and all that was made possible, you know, through social media. We have seen how the government has pushed back on that by, you know, trying to, you know, use the Ministry of Communication to kind of like, you know, push back and make sure that people are not able to access data and all these different kind of things. And people have pivoted and said, we can use VPNs. You know, we are not stopping this fight. And really, so many people have leaned, you know, onto social media. So for me, I would say I have seen the positive, you know, effects that it has done for our people and us pushing back on authoritarian rule. You know, on the second question of, you know, like deciding which human rights are we supposed to fight, you know, for, and like, oh, right now let's move this way. This is why we ended up here. You know, when you decide that the rights of trans people are not as important as the rights of women. This is how we ended up here. So if we are talking about building a new democracy, and I call it democracy 2.0 because this first one has done what it needed to do and now we need to build another one, is that everybody needs to sit on that table. There is no two way about it. Everybody needs to sit on that table. Right now in Kenya, I have so many people who are not queer, who are in the women movements, who come to me and say, please tell us how you guys have managed to organize for over 20 years and push back on such harmful laws, and still even have wins when it comes to some certain court rulings. Please tell us, because we want to learn from you. And that's what needed to happen, from the start. Everybody needed to be included. So yeah.
I'll be very brief.
Yeah, no.
So first of all, I think that, Votalist, we started 21 years ago. We're 21 years young, and we are a digital-first organization. To tell you my bona fides, we started on MySpace. Okay. And so we've always used narrative. We've always used technology to be able to, become the democratization of the most marginalized. And we've done various campaigns. If you were to ask me, though, that we are now peeking through a completely different era than what we experienced. And it is going to be far more sophisticated, the disinformation and the deep fakes that we're going to see. And we can go down the rabbit hole of what those dangers are with a body in government right now that doesn't seem to have an appetite for regulating AI in any way, with guardrails. And I do think that is all of a sudden, if you were to ask me like what an opportunity is that's when we needed the EU to be really, 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 really tough on these folks, so that they can create standards that will spill over into the United States. That's an idea. But the other thing is that with someone that is taking a sledgehammer to all of our institutions, maybe it's an opportunity for us to use technology to reimagine what our institutions that were built for the last century that served us super well, how can we leverage them to rebuild our institutions to meet the needs of the 21st century? And so as painful it is to see what's happening at the State Department and the Department of Education, instead of having a party that says, no, they can't go, why don't we have a party that says, how do we reimagine it to meet the needs of the American people and internationally? And so I leave you with that piece of hope that I actually deeply believe that in this moment of rubble, there's going to be an opportunity to think really, really, really big. Because if anything, what the American people have told us is that the systems are not working for them right now. And they're not wrong. But how do we use technology and be adaptive and learn best practices and really imagine what does a multicultural democracy look for the 21st century that serves the most marginalized, but thrives and is an example for the rest of the world?
Thank you. You had one very quick, you get the very last word.
So the Grenfell Towers fire in Britain, when the building fell down and so many lives were lost, the majority of the people who died were disabled people. Again, had that building been designed with inclusivity in mind, so many more lives would have been saved. The curbs that have the smooth, that you can go down, English is eluding me right now, but you know what I'm talking about, right? When it is built in that way, it serves the mother who's pushing a child on a pram. It serves so many other people. When we talk about the toilets, the struggle around the toilets for trans people, I remember a time in South Africa when there were certain toilets some of us couldn't use, right? The toilet is a symbol of segregation and othering. So the point I'm fundamentally trying to illustrate is when we are inclusive, we all win. It actually doesn't matter that you think you are okay and you don't need it right now, because you will come to a moment where you need it, and even if you don't, those you love will. And you will never thrive in a society when you are the only one who is doing well and no one around you is. Yeah.
Thank you.